What's the most horrifying thing you've ever witnessed? Story 1. I sat in the living room with my mom and dad, talking to my mom about why I could not stand her as a person. She asked me how I really felt, so I told her. Being a young teenager, I did not hold back and did not think about how much it would hurt her. You know what that is like, I am sure. Mom went to her room after crying heavily during the entire conversation. Dad and I left the house to breathe and get food. We pulled into the driveway and Dad asked me to feed the dog. But being a kid dodging chores, I told him I would take the food inside instead. I walked in the door calling for my mom to get the food. She did not answer, so I walked into her room. She was lying face down on the bed completely unconscious, her bed covered in pills from an assortment of bottles in her substance bag. There was a yellow legal pad sheet with red ink bleeding through the paper, every single word of her suic note written with force. I yelled for Dad I do not know how many times, and he came upstairs and called 911. I sat on the porch reading her suic note over and over until emergency medical services arrived and took the note from me. As foolish as this sounds, I just started running and did not stop until I reached the next county. I will never forget her face, her skin, or pushing on her trying to wake her up. I ask myself every day why I did not just feed the dog, or why I said the things that I did. Story 2. I watched my father die in front of me in our backyard. We were cleaning up and doing some general landscaping when he went inside for some sodas. He came back out, dropped a soda, then picked it up and sat down to drink it. I turned toward him and saw soda dripping from his mouth. The right side of his face had drooped, and I told him he was having a stroke. He tried to say that he was fine, but his words were garbled. He fell to the ground, and I held him up until the ambulance arrived. I could hear the sirens getting louder and louder as they came closer to the house. When we got to the hospital, they told us he had suffered a catastrophic stroke and blood had leaked into his brain. The rest of his body was still functioning, so they put him on a morphine drip, and he officially passed later that night in hospice. I still replay it in my head. He has been gone for 6 years on June 5th at 10:10 in the evening. I miss him so much, and even more now that my wife and I are trying to have a baby. Story 3. I was on my motorcycle heading to my friend's house on a big 6-lane road at night. I pulled in to get gas, and just as I was leaving the station, I saw what looked like my friend's motorcycle. I did not know he had just been heading home from the gym on the same road as me. It was just a coincidence. Seconds later, I saw an accident scene ahead, and the moment I saw the bike, I knew who it was. It was my best friend lying in the road, lit by headlights, pieces of his motorcycle everywhere. The way his body was twisted was unlike anything I had ever seen. His right arm was bent the wrong way. His left arm was shattered. His left leg was in pieces, barely held together by skin. He still had his helmet on, and blood was flowing out of it. I was watching my best friend die in the street in front of me. Thankfully, an emergency room nurse was one of the first people to stop. I am a photojournalist, so I started taking pictures to document it, while shaking, trembling, and crying. The accident was a dreaded left turn situation, where a car turns directly in front of a motorcycle. He was going about 50 miles per hour, roughly 10 feet before impact. There was a single dark skid mark, then the collision. His body hit the side of the truck at high speed as the left side of his body shattered and bones splintered. I immediately started calling everyone within a 30-minute radius. I remember calling my brother and telling him that if there was anything he needed to say to Andy, he needed to get there now. It felt like forever. He lay in the street for about half an hour as paramedics worked to stabilize him. As I stood over him, his eyes opened. He recognized me and kept whispering my name. But he was completely disoriented. I told him I would take care of everything. Then I had to call his mother, who was 3 hours away. Knowing she might not make it in time if he died, I told her he was in bad shape, but that they were doing everything they could and that she needed to get there immediately. Then the helicopter arrived. He was airlifted to the hospital, closer to death than I had ever seen anyone outside of a funeral. He was in surgery for more than 10 hours the first day and endured over a dozen surgeries after that. He spent 20 days in intensive care and more than a month in the hospital. He lost 30 pounds just from being on intravenous fluids. He spent 2 months confined to a hospital bed in his own home and began walking again after 2 months with a titanium rod in his left leg surrounded by slowly regenerating bone. The accident delayed his law degree by a year, but he returned to law school once he was strong enough. He graduated at the top of his class, summa cum laude, from the University of Florida. His father, who flew from Argentina to help with his recovery, passed away during my friend's final year of law school. Today, my friend is a top lawyer working for a federal district court less than a year out of law school. To this day, he has not regained full use of his left arm and hand, though we hope he will one day. He used the photographs I took to sue the driver who turned in front of him. That driver fled the country and never returned. I remember standing on the side of the road that night, not knowing who had hit him, watching a supposed witness tell the police that my friend was going too fast. He was not. That man tried to shift blame while my friend lay dying in the street. My dream is that one day my best friend will get justice from the person who nearly killed him and then ran away. Until then, my friend has built an incredible life and is one of the best lawyers in the country. Story 4. I have never admitted this chain of events to anyone in real life out of fear that they would not want to be my friend. So here it goes. In first grade, while trick or treating, a guy jumped out of the bushes to scare us. My friend ran into the street in fear and was hit by a car and died. The guy who scared us was my brother's best friend, and the man driving the car was our neighbor. In third grade, I was playing with two friends at one friend's house when one of them disappeared for a minute and came back holding a pistol. Before me or my other friend could say anything, he accidentally fired it into my other friend's head, killing him instantly. Just like that, two of my best friends were gone, and the kid who fired the gun moved away. In fourth grade, I went to visit my best friend in the hospital. He had childhood leukemia, so he was not expected to live long, but after receiving a bone marrow transplant that seemed to be working, he was given a blood transfusion that ended his life. It happened on the exact day I went to visit him. In high school, just before graduation, I asked a girl out on a date. She said yes, and I really liked her. That same night, she was riding in a Jeep with a friend who flipped it, and she was killed. In college, we were caravanning across a mountain pass back to school. There were 3 people in the car ahead of us, 2 friends and another guy. He took a corner too fast for the conditions, rolled the car, and 2 of the 3 died. The only one I did not know survived. Later in life, I reconnected with a friend from high school after our reunion. We shared stories about family and life, and 2 weeks later he died while working on his car. I also reconnected online with a girl I dated in high school. She sent me a strange, manic message trying to get me involved in some marketing scheme, then went on about how much she loved me. I was happily married by then and told her we had good memories. 2 weeks later, I found out she ended her own life. Story 5. I grew up in an extremely rough part of West Virginia when I was a kid, the kind of place where trouble was normal and survival felt like luck. One day I was outside in the neighborhood playing baseball with my friends when we saw an older kid named Lorenzo running past us in a panic. Lorenzo was something of a local star because he was such a talented ball player, and we all looked up to him. Around that time, it had become well known that he was getting caught up in selling substances, like many of the older kids in the area. When he ran past us, we chased after him because it was obvious something was wrong. After a while, he stopped in front of our elementary school, turned around, and tried to catch his breath. All he said was that they were going to kill him and that he could not escape them. He reached into his pants and pulled out a small pistol. All of us screamed for him not to do it, but he pressed it to his temple and ended his life right there, the impact splattering against the school's entrance wall. His body stayed upright for a moment as we stared in shock, then slowly tipped over and fell lifeless onto the sidewalk. It is the most disturbing thing I have ever witnessed, and I hope nothing will ever come close to it again. Story 6. When I was 7 years old, my mother was assaulted by 2 men she considered friends, and it happened in front of me. We were homeless at the time due to her complete mental breakdown. She had become pregnant by a man she loved, but for reasons I still do not fully understand, he left. She gave her son up for adoption, and shortly after that, she suffered a breakdown that caused her to lose her job, our apartment, and any willingness to rebuild her life. She turned to severe alcohol abuse and nearly got us removed from the homeless shelter where we were staying. During her drinking episodes, she sometimes refused to go back to the shelter at night, forcing me to stay awake with her and whatever man she was clinging to at the time. These episodes could last for days, often meaning we slept in cars for a few hours at a time. On one particular night, some people she knew from years earlier wanted to party, which meant hard substances for them. I do not think my mother took part, but she became extremely drunk and blacked out for hours. They drove us to a park, laid her on the grass under a tree, and assaulted her while she screamed for them to stop. I was in the car pretending to sleep, but I saw everything. Later, they got back into the car laughing and making crude comments. My mother swears she remembers none of it, which makes sense given how intoxicated she was. First grade was a very hard year for me. Story 7, I had to work in a cadaver laboratory several times during an internship, where I was part of a product development team for medical devices and implants. I was with a group from my lab and we were testing an implant on a severed human leg. Once the testing was finished and it was time to leave, my supervisor turned to me and told me to place the leg into a large biohazard bag, seal it, and put it into the freezer. I wrapped the leg up and carried it over, which was already an uncomfortable experience on its own, and then slid open the freezer door. What I saw inside was the most horrifying sight I have ever witnessed. It was a massive freezer room filled with dozens upon dozens of human body parts everywhere, hanging from walls, stacked in piles, arms, legs, torsos, hands, everything imaginable. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie. The smell was overwhelming, and if I had not just spent the previous 4 hours working with human remains, I probably would have passed out. Many of the parts were thankfully sealed in bags, but standing there and realizing how many deceased human bodies were concentrated in that one space was deeply unsettling. I threw the bag I was holding inside as fast as I could and slammed the freezer door shut without looking back. Story 8. This one is a tie for me between watching a motorcyclist get thrown into a car and being in the passenger seat of a vehicle that struck a 12-year-old girl. In the first incident, I was sitting in my car in a parking lot near the head of a T-shaped intersection. A man was riding a high-performance motorcycle across the top of the intersection at a fairly high speed. A woman in a Hyundai did not see him and made a left turn just as he reached the intersection. He was launched headfirst into the side of her car. I was about 150 feet away and could immediately tell he was in extremely bad condition. His motorcycle was destroyed, and his body was positioned in a way that did not look natural, and he was twitching. People quickly surrounded him to try to help, so I drove away rather than watch what happened next. Later, my aunt, who worked as a nurse at the local trauma center, told me that his spine had been severed and that he passed away later that day. A few years before that, I was in the passenger seat while a friend was driving on a 4-lane road in the middle lane. As we crested a hill, we saw a car stopped in the outside lane with its brake lights on. Just as we approached, we saw a girl's leg appear in front of that car. The driver had stopped to let her cross, completely blocking our view. My friend slammed on the brakes and tried to swerve, but there was nowhere to go. We struck one of the girls and she came up over the hood and through the windshield, landing briefly in my lap before being pushed forward off the front of the car as we came to a stop. The second girl was struck by the side mirror, which collapsed, and she was thrown backward. The outcome was that the first girl survived with a broken leg and arm and no lasting injuries. Because my friend was driving a low sports coupe and the front of the car dipped under heavy braking, she was lifted onto the vehicle instead of going underneath it. The man who had stopped to let her cross was charged and sued, and my friend was credited with a fast reaction that likely saved her life, as he was not speeding and there was very little else he could have done. The most disturbing detail was that the impact lifted her completely out of her shoes, leaving them neatly on the road about 20 feet behind the car. At the time, I was in the process of getting my driver's license, and I could not get behind the wheel again for 3 years. Story 9. Watching my mother die was the most horrifying experience of my life. She went into the hospital on Wednesday morning, and the doctor told us she was going to die. Our family set up camp in her room, and for 3 days I watched her slowly deteriorate, from being unable to stand, to being unable to talk, to losing consciousness, to breathing erratically, and finally gasping for every breath. It was agonizing for her and for me. For 3 days, I begged God to take her. For 3 days, all I wanted to do was run out of that room, but I could not leave her. When she finally passed, instead of the relief I thought I would feel, I suddenly could not breathe. I cried without tears because they had been used up, making broken sounds as I struggled to get air. Later, when I got home, I realized that during those 3 days I had somehow lost 20 pounds, as if I had grieved it out of my body. The most terrifying part, though, happened in the brief window after she could no longer speak but before she lost consciousness. I saw her wide, frightened eyes searching the room, filled with terror and pleading for help. I realized then that it was not just death that scared her. She had suddenly understood that she could not speak and would never get to say the things we all want to say to the people we love when we know the end is near. We always think there will be more time, but for her, time had run out while she was still fully aware and completely unable to communicate. I leaned in close and said the most comforting thing I could think of, telling her that I knew she loved me, repeating it so she would not have to say it herself. Story 10. A few years ago, my fiance and I were hit by a drunk driver who was going 70 miles per hour in a 30-mile-per-hour zone. He slammed directly into my fiance's side of the car. When I looked to my left, there was no sign of him at all, no driver's side door, nothing. I had suffered a serious concussion and started panicking, trying to get out of the car to find him. I thought I was trapped, when in reality the only things holding me back were my seatbelt and a locked door. I started screaming his name, not even knowing if he was alive. I was terrified. What felt like an eternity later, I saw him trying to stand at the front of the car. He was bleeding, limping, and completely disoriented. His head had a deep open wound, with blood covering his face and bone visible. I finally figured out how to unbuckle and unlock the door. He reached his hand toward me with a confused look, and I saw torn flesh hanging from it. His shin was split open from knee to ankle, and his front teeth were chipped and bleeding. Even in that condition, he was trying to rescue me. Just thinking about it brings tears to my eyes, let alone writing it out. If anyone is wondering, he survived and is fine now. Story 11. 2 years ago, I was living in Guangdong, China, and my girlfriend was severely anemic. She called her mother to say she was feeling faint and planned to stop at a local clinic to receive an intravenous drip, which was commonly used for many ailments there. I stayed with her, and her mother called again, telling her to come home and drink some soup instead. When we arrived, the smell in the house was overwhelming, and I noticed an empty bag next to the pot on the stove that looked like a blood donation bag. Inside the soup were small gray pieces of meat that looked very strange. As I looked closer, I saw a small round piece that had been cut in half and what appeared to be a tiny arm. My heart started racing and my stomach dropped. I asked her mother what it was, and she explained that it was a medicinal soup, with the main ingredient being a woman's afterbirth. When I asked her to explain further, I learned that it was a placenta containing an aborted fetus measuring about 6 centimeters. Although it was technically illegal, I found out that one could purchase a fetus from a hospital for around 500 renminbi. My girlfriend did not understand why I was so disturbed, explaining that she had eaten this soup 5 or 6 times as a child. Needless to say, I left shortly after. Story 12. I grew up in a war zone, spending 2 years under siege when I was between 5 and 7 years old. I was shot at by snipers in the streets, had a tank shell land near me that blew my friend's legs off in front of my eyes, saw headless bodies being dragged into ambulances, watched neighbors come into our yard and kill our dog because we were of a different religion, and even had bullets fired into our home at night, with one round coming through the bedroom wall and striking my pillow while I was sleeping. As terrifying as all of that was, the worst part came when we tried to escape. We sold everything we owned and spent all the money we had bribing our way out of the country. But even that was not enough. At a border checkpoint, we were stopped and forced at gunpoint to start walking back, while my father alone was allowed to pass. This was a common tactic, allowing only the husband or father through, knowing he would not abandon his family and would stay behind. My father had other plans. My mother and I slipped around the checkpoint, sneaking past guards with machine guns and hiding for most of the night inside truck tires and beneath rotting wooden planks while my father paid the driver the last of our money to wait for us. Minutes later, on the same bus, we were stopped again by a random patrol demanding stamped passports. My mother and I had no stamps because we had bypassed the previous checkpoint. We owe our lives to a kind guard who saw us covered in mud and tears sitting beside my father and chose to only ask him for his passport, saying he did not need to see ours because we were with him. And he even winked at me. We eventually made it out and lived illegally for about 9 months in another European country, shoveling snow, cleaning staircases in old buildings, and sometimes sleeping on the streets. Later, thanks to second-generation family connections in Australia and more money-changing hands, we were approved to enter as refugees. We were accepted largely because both of my parents held university degrees, as the authorities prioritized skills and education, with the money only ensuring our case was considered. We arrived with a single suitcase of clothes. 16 years later, we own 2 homes, 3 cars, and have no mortgage. My parents' degrees were never recognized, so my mother built a cleaning business, and my father worked his way up in a mechanical fitting and turning company until he became a supervisor. I helped by doing a paper route for 10 years and am now at university. My grandmother could not escape with us because she was too old, and later attempts to bring her out failed. She was killed a few months after we arrived, and that loss hurt me the most because she was like a second mother to me. Story 13. I used to think I did not have a story like the terrible ones others shared until the realization hit me all at once. I worked in a youth development center for children with serious criminal and psychological issues. One boy, Josh, stood out immediately. He was much smaller than the others, painfully thin, extremely pale, with large ice blue eyes that could be deeply unsettling, especially during his episodes. He could turn violent in an instant. On my first day, he argued with another boy and threw a plastic toiletry box filled with personal items. The other kid ducked and the box shattered against the wall, and another staff member and I broke it up. About 30 minutes later, once things had calmed down, Josh walked over to apologize. In a blink, his hand shot up and dropped back to his side. I thought he had tried to slap the other boy, but instead I realized he had fashioned a 9-inch shard of plastic from the broken box into a weapon during that half hour. And that was when I understood what I was dealing with. Violence was common there, and many days were overwhelming, but the worst incident came later. One morning, a coworker met me at the door, looking drained and expressionless. Without saying much, he guided me down the hall to an empty dormitory room used for storage and told me to check the bathroom. It was covered in blood, splattered on the toilet, floor, walls, and dripping down the sink. On the floor were a jagged aluminum tube and blood-soaked cloths. I was told that when Josh became enraged beyond control, he isolated himself in that room. In that state, he had used the metal tube to seriously injure himself, then attempted to clean up and continue on as if nothing had happened. By the time I arrived, he had already been taken to the hospital and then transferred to a psychiatric unit on campus. Within a few days, he was returned to the general population. That moment changed how I understood trauma, violence, and how deeply damaged a child could be. Story 14. I must have been around 13 or 14 years old at the time. There were 3 of us who had gone up to the local grade school to smoke, since it was August, extremely hot outside, and there were no kids around. It was me, my girlfriend, and our mutual friend Nico. We had all gotten pretty intoxicated smoking out of an apple, and were heading back to my place a few blocks away to play Super Mario Kart. When we reached the highway we had crossed 1,000 times before, we waited for the crosswalk signal and started walking. There were cars stopped at the light in both directions like usual. As we reached the middle of the crosswalk, out of nowhere a car swerved at around 50 miles per hour to avoid the stopped vehicles, cutting into the middle lane. Nico was walking a few feet in front of us while my girlfriend and I were holding hands. The car spun out, and as the back end fishtailed while the drunk driver tried to regain control, it struck Nico from her right side while she was looking back over her left shoulder at us. She cartwheeled face first across the intersection and slammed into a car waiting at the light on the opposite side, more than 25 feet away. The driver never stopped, correcting his steering and disappearing down a side street. The whole thing felt unreal and detached, like my mind could not process how 1 second she was walking in front of me and the next she was airborne. My girlfriend collapsed to the ground crying and would not move, and it took me a moment to understand what had happened. I ran across the intersection to where Nico lay, half on the hood of the car she had struck, surrounded by people calling emergency services on large brick phones. When I reached her, the sight of her is burned into my memory forever. The entire right side of her body was twisted unnaturally. Her right arm and leg shattered in multiple places, and her ribs crushed. Her face was the worst part, split open with her jaw broken into sections and pouring blood. One eye was still moving, unfocused, and she was making a horrible gurgling, sucking sound as she struggled to breathe through the destruction of her face, likely with a collapsed lung. Hearing that sound with every breath made me wish it had been me instead of her, just to spare her the suffering. She remained alive for about 10 minutes, making that sound until the ambulance arrived, and she died shortly after they moved her off the hood of the car. Story 15. I was at my friend's apartment on the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus at around 3 in the morning. We were getting ready to leave, so I stepped outside, and I heard shouting as about 9 people poured out of the house next door, where a party was happening. At first it looked like a typical fight, and it annoyed me, but I quickly realized it was actually 8 people beating one man. He fell to the ground and they started kicking him repeatedly while he was down. I pulled out my phone and ran toward them, yelling for them to stop and telling them I was calling the police, which I did. As I ran closer, the man on the ground tried to get up, and one of them kicked him hard in the chin, snapping his head backward violently. One of the attackers noticed me approaching, gathered the others, and they fled. I considered chasing them but decided to check on the man instead. He was lying in the middle of the road in a pool of blood, his head twisted at an unnatural angle, and though he was still breathing, every breath made a rattling, rasping sound that I know I will never forget. I stayed until the police arrived and watched as they loaded him into an ambulance and drove away. I never found out whether he survived or died. Story 16. I empathize with everyone who has shared their experiences, and I created a throwaway account because many people I know are on my friends list and local forums, and I prefer to keep my private life private. I am sharing this only in the hope that it might steer someone away from danger. Years ago, I was heavily involved with hard substances, mostly MDMA and Hero. The core group I spent time with consisted of 8 women and myself. These were not stereotypical people. Several of them were highly educated, some with master's degrees. One of them, who I will call Kathy, was especially cynical and completely heartless. Someone else, who I will call Jane, had crossed her, and out of fear that Jane would report her and cost her a fortune in prison time, Kathy decided to act. She had a lot of money, no conscience, and no fear of taking a life. After researching Jane, she lured her to a remote part of the state where money was scarce. I was young, did not drive, and was under Kathy's influence, and at the time I did not fully understand what was happening. Jane was substance-used and struck from behind, knocking her unconscious, and I watched from a crack in the motel door. Kathy claimed it was an accident and said we needed to take Jane to the hospital. She suggested I sleep, and although I felt uneasy, I pretended to rest in the back seat while staying alert. Instead of going to a hospital, Kathy drove far past town to a junkyard. I later saw her exchange cash with a man who drove away. She then dragged Jane into an old car and drove it onto what I realized was a crusher. At first I thought it was some kind of cruel prank, until Jane regained consciousness. The sound of screaming mixed with crushing metal is something I will never forget. I believe Jane was restrained inside the vehicle and could not escape. That moment has stayed with me ever since, and scenes involving car accidents still trigger memories of that day. Almost 8 years have passed and I have been sober for 4 of them. I never learned who Jane really was, and no one else from that time seemed to know what had happened. Kathy left the country long ago. I still check missing persons reports but have never found answers. I hope that if anyone reads this, they choose to walk away from dangerous situations before something irreversible happens. Story 17. I was in Toronto after crossing through Detroit and wanted to buy marijuana since we could not bring any across the border. We went to a smoking cafe and asked a young guy if he could help us. While talking, he told us he had acquired immune deficiency syndrome and did not have much time left, which was why he had a medical card. As we walked toward a dispensary, a frantic woman approached us, screaming and crying, desperately asking for meth. It was one of the most disturbing things I had ever seen. The guy we were with yelled at her to leave, and I noticed he knew her by name. When I gently asked him about it, he explained that they used to use meth together every day, and that he had contracted his illness from sharing needles. He told us he had been clean for 3 months, But before that, he had been homeless and addicted just like her. The entire encounter burned itself into my memory and completely turned me away from ever touching substances like that. Seeing the consequences up close was enough. The guy eventually broke down crying in front of us, even though we were complete strangers. I never saw him again, but I still hope he found peace. He was a genuinely kind person who had been dealt a tragic hand in life. Story 18. This one needs a little setup. My father used to work for Charity Hospital, a publicly funded hospital in New Orleans. Decades ago, the hospital bought several bunkers in a remote part of Louisiana for storage. These bunkers had originally been built for processing volatile chemicals, with a heavy door on one side and earth piled up on the other. Basically terrifying hobbit hole-looking structures. They were used to store old furniture, shelving, cabinets, and hospital equipment that had been replaced but never destroyed. One day my dad got permission to go out there and take anything he thought we could use at home. The sunlight barely reached 10 feet inside the bunker, and after that you had to navigate by flashlight through a maze of dusty furniture and equipment. Everything was coated in thick dust, and the smell was a nauseating mix of hospital chemicals and old wood. My dad warned me to be careful because there were probably spiders everywhere, and told me not to touch cobwebs or open anything, just to call out if I found something useful. I was around 10 years old, terrified and trying not to show it. Then my flashlight reflected off something glass. I looked closer and saw glass cylinders filled with pale white arms and legs. I completely panicked, screamed, and ran back shaking and crying, my heart pounding. I told them what I had seen and could barely speak. I do not remember if my dad went to look, but I do remember that we immediately left and never went back that day. Looking back, it was probably mannequin limbs, and there is no way preserved tissue could have been left out like that. Still, in my memory all these years later, I swear those arms and legs were moving. Story 19. I was driving home late one night, just about to complete a flyover of the 5 freeway between my friend's house and mine, when I noticed a single police car stopped in the road ahead with no lights on. I slowed down, and as I approached, I saw a green minivan sitting in the middle of the intersection. The light turned red and I stopped. It looked like the driver had failed to make the turn onto the freeway off-ramp, probably going too fast, and had struck the center median. Even though the curb was only about half a foot high, the front of the minivan was completely crushed. When the light turned green, I slowly drove forward, though part of me wishes I had turned away and avoided the scene altogether. Passing through that intersection felt like it took 5 full minutes. The image still flashes into my mind sometimes, just as vivid as the first time. The police officer was standing between his patrol car and the van with his hands on the back of his head, looking completely overwhelmed, like he had no idea what to do next. I was about 23 at the time, and he did not look old enough to buy beer. The driver of the minivan had somehow been ejected and was lying in the road. I could not tell if the body was face up or face down, or even if it was a man or a woman. I only remember an arm twitching, a pool of blood slowly rolling downhill, and a trail of blood and debris connecting the body to the van. It was the first dead body I had ever seen, and it shook me deeply. I do not remember the final mile of the drive home, only parking the car, turning off the engine, and sitting there for an hour. Because of that, the shock was already familiar when I later found my grandmother's body. She died peacefully in her sleep, but in the days before, she began having vivid hallucinations. 2 nights before she passed, I watched her have a full conversation with her father, who had been dead since the 1940s. She had never shown signs of dementia before, and seeing it was deeply unsettling. Later, I learned that such experiences before death are not uncommon. On the same day my grandmother died, I came home to find my pet rabbit had also passed away. When I lifted her stiff body to bury her, pressure on her chest forced air from her lungs, making it sound like she sighed, and one of her eyes opened and seemed to look straight at me. I know it was only a rabbit, but combined with everything else that day, it remains the most terrifying thing I have ever seen. Afterward, I buried her and cried for hours. Story 20. When I was 12 years old, I went to stay at my brother's house for the weekend. He was living in London at the time, sharing a large townhouse with a lot of other students. probably around 15 people in total. One of the students had a young baby. My brother went out for lectures during the day, so I was left alone in the house and spent my time wandering around, snooping through rooms like a nosy kid. The house was quiet, and I assumed everyone was out. When I reached the top floor, I heard the baby making soft, gurgling sounds in one of the bedrooms, so I quietly headed back downstairs, worried that the baby's mother might catch me snooping and tell my brother. Then I heard a man's voice whispering from the baby's room and assumed it was the baby's father. So I hurried downstairs and stayed in my brother's room eating food. About 20 to 30 minutes later, bored again, I went to the kitchen and saw a man standing there with the baby lying on the table. What I witnessed froze me in place and terrified me. He did not see me. I ran back to my brother's room, locked the door, and called him, completely panicking and convinced the man might come after me. Long story short, it turned out to be the baby's father, and he was abusing his own 4-month-old daughter. I went home the next day. My brother told me that after the police and social services got involved, the man, the baby, and the mother all moved out together. I was never asked to make a statement and never heard anything from the police afterward. The entire experience was extremely dark and disturbing. Story 21. Growing up, one thing my brothers and I found annoying was that our father always waited at least 3 full seconds after a traffic light turned green before driving through an intersection. His reasoning was that he did not want to get hit by someone running a red light. We thought it was ridiculous until one day a small sedan next to us went immediately when the light turned green and was instantly smashed directly in the side by a larger car that must have been going around 50 miles per hour trying to beat the light. Both vehicles were full of people and bodies were thrown everywhere. One person was clearly dead with severe head injuries. Another car following the smaller sedan, presumably family members, pulled over and people rushed out screaming and crying. Emergency services arrived quickly, and because of how the wreckage was positioned, traffic was forced to drive in a near full circle around the scene, bringing us face to face with the devastation. Ever since that day, if you ride in a car with me, expect to wait a full 3 seconds after the light turns green before I move. And even then, I go cautiously. Story 22. My wife and I have been married for almost 5 years and have a beautiful, healthy 2-year-old son. We decided to try for another child and were shocked when she became pregnant immediately after stopping birth control, especially since it had taken around 10 months with our first. Sadly, she miscarried at the beginning of the second trimester. There was no sudden event. We found out during our routine checkup that the baby had already died weeks earlier, though her body had not recognized it and she was still producing pregnancy hormones. Because of this, she needed a medical procedure under general anesthesia to remove the fetus. On the day of the procedure, a friend watched our son while I took my wife to the clinic and waited with her as she was prepared. I kissed her and smiled as they wheeled her away. Then the worst moment of my life happened. Staff came out and told me she had reacted badly to the anesthesia, that a mistake had been made, she had lost too much blood, and her heart had stopped. I stood there completely numb, thinking about how she was my entire life, how she had pulled me out of loneliness and given me purpose, and how she was an incredible mother and role model. I could not imagine raising our son alone. Then about 15 minutes later, they wheeled her back in, already waking up. I had to bite my lip to stop myself from breaking down and frightening everyone around me, and I forced myself to stay calm as she opened her eyes. Shortly before Mother's Day, I wrote her a 1-page letter explaining what she meant to me and how deeply she had changed my life, attaching a favorite photo of her playing with our son. Writing it was one of the most emotional and grounding things I have ever done. Story 23. A few years ago, I was working as an engineer at a cement plant when something truly horrible happened. Above the long rotary kiln, there was a conveyor system that fed whole car tires into an airlock leading into the kiln. These tires jammed constantly, causing serious operational problems, and it was the job of one of the shift workers to clear the jams using a long pole with a spike and hook on the end. On what seemed like a normal day, I was up on the platform trying to figure out a way to reduce how often these jams occurred when one happened right in front of us. The shift worker came up and started poking at the jam, and suddenly it cleared. When it did, he slipped forward slightly, and his coveralls, which were too large for him, got caught in the drive roller of the conveyor. His arm was pulled in and wrapped around the roller in the opposite direction of how an elbow bends, tearing it almost completely off his body. Everything after that is a blur. I know I hit the emergency stop, called for help, and did what I could to keep him from bleeding out, but I barely remember it. He was taken to the hospital and underwent 20 hours of surgery to reattach his arm. He was 19 years old. I have never seen so much blood in my life. Story 24, I was in Guatemala on a mission trip back when I was still religious. Our group made a 4-hour drive from a city compound to a small village where we would be staying and building chicken coops and similar projects. The village had about 13 families. We stayed for 3 nights to understand their needs and experience their way of life, then drove back to the city for 2 nights to gather supplies, food, and water. On the morning we were packed and ready to return, we received word that most of the villagers had attended a wedding in another village. They had pooled money, traded tortillas, and hitchhiked rides in an open-back truck. That truck took a curve too fast, went off the road, and rolled down a hill, throwing people out in every direction. We left immediately and went to the nearest hospital. While the main adults went inside, I was tasked with gathering supplies from nearby pharmacies because I spoke the best Spanish among those staying outside. Along with my younger brother and 2 others, I bought as much medicine and bandaging as possible. When we returned to the bus, the injured villagers were being released because the hospital could not keep them. Out of about 30 people on the truck, 9 had died, including 2 children. We loaded supplies into the back of the bus and gave seats to the injured, making sandwiches for them because they had not eaten in 2 days, and helping clean and rewrap their wounds. We even brought a doctor from another village back with us. When we returned to the village, the women who had stayed behind ran to meet us and quickly realized who was missing. Several collapsed in grief, making a sound I will never forget as their children clung to them without understanding. Everyone had injuries, burns, broken bones, and deep trauma. The most horrifying moment came days later when one of the women who had survived the accident but lost her husband gave birth to a stillborn baby. She held the child in her arms, rocking back and forth and crying for hours. Because she spoke Spanish, I could understand her words, and hearing a grieving widow and mother in that moment was devastating beyond anything I had ever known. Story 25. I was about 10 or 11 years old when I went commercial fishing with my dad, completely fascinated by the sea life and the unfamiliar world around me. When we reached the fishing grounds, my dad let me roam freely on a sandbar during low tide. I ran around joyfully, scaring massive flocks of seagulls into the air, only to have them rain droppings down on me. I brushed it off and kept exploring. When I reached the far side of the sandbar, I found something that still haunts me. While poking at driftwood and debris, I came across the end of a gill net. As I followed it along the shore, I noticed a thick swarm of flies surrounding an area ahead of me. Continuing forward, I discovered the source. A man whose face was barely recognizable after being eaten away by the water and wildlife was tangled in the net. He had likely drowned while trying to free himself. His left hand was still clenched around a Victorinox knife, and as the reality set in, I saw a crab crawling out of his empty eye socket. I ran back to my dad's boat and told him what I had seen. He checked and immediately called the Coast Guard. It turned out the man was a fisherman who had gone out in severe weather, and his boat had capsized in the breakers. Story 26. My wife and I were traveling northbound on the 101 just outside of Summerlin in her Honda Civic, driving in the fast lane. A brand new white Mitsubishi Montero in front of us drifted slightly to the right and hit the lane reflectors. Then the driver overcorrected and overcorrected again, causing the vehicle to roll multiple times directly in front of me before coming to rest on its side. A small boy and a woman were ejected from the vehicle. My first instinct was to stop without hitting the wreck or getting rear-ended, and somehow all lanes of traffic came to a stop without any additional crashes. I ran to the SUV and heard several people screaming from inside. A woman handed me a small girl through the shattered rear window. Other men were trying to lift the SUV when I noticed the woman who had been ejected was pinned underneath the vehicle from the waist down. She was screaming at me, but I could not understand her since the family was Hispanic, and I believe I was holding her child at that moment. The boy who had been thrown from the vehicle had small pieces of flesh hanging from his hands and arms, but otherwise looked surprisingly stable. Another woman was holding him, and we gave them a blanket from our trunk to wrap him in. There were at least 7 people inside that vehicle, including 2 small children, with no child seats and clear underuse of seat belts, and the scene is something I will never forget. Story 27. I am an X-ray and computed tomography technician, and at one hospital where I worked, we were frequently called to the morgue for post-mortem imaging. The medical examiner for a large region operated out of that location, so most cases involved homicides or suics, usually to document bullet paths and injuries. This work never bothered me much, so I often volunteered, and I could usually tell what we would be imaging based on the film sizes requested. One day I was asked to bring an unusual assortment of sizes. When I arrived, the medical examiner had a strange expression and told me he would need a bit of everything. As we walked to the cooler, he pulled out a very small body bag, and I immediately understood it was an abuse series, which is done for infants and young children. It was a 2-week-old baby. He explained that the imaging was only a formality, as the cause of death was accidental suffocation when the mother rolled onto the baby while they slept. The baby had already had organs harvested for transplant and was very light, fully sutured. I completed the imaging and went back to work trying to push it out of my mind. 4 days later, my niece was born at the same hospital, and everyone teased me because I refused to hold her. I could not explain why. Story 28. The most horrifying thing I ever witnessed was seeing my father dead. I was 16 and about a month away from turning 17. That night I was working on a scholarship application, and my dad had been helping me. As he went upstairs, he joked that he would help me finish the essay tomorrow, and I said goodnight. Sometime later, in the middle of the night, I woke to my mother calling my name in a calm but terrifying tone, telling me I needed to be strong and come upstairs. I had never heard her sound like that. As I climbed the stairs, my mind raced through possibilities involving my younger brothers. Near the top, I heard my father's alarm clock going off. The sunlight was pouring in as I entered the room, and when my eyes adjusted, I saw my father lying face down on the floor, naked and completely still. His skin was pale, and it was immediately clear something was very wrong. I began pacing in shock while my mother called emergency services. The operator told us we needed to turn him over. I begged not to, but my mother insisted. I grabbed his leg, which was ice cold, and she took his arm and we turned him onto his back. Rigor mortis had already set in. His face was covered in blood, his tongue protruding, and the front of his body was dark purple from pooled blood. I stood there in disbelief, feeling like it was a dream, knowing it was the last time I would ever see him. Emergency responders arrived and took him away. I had a panic attack, and my younger brother became physically sick. My father had been a firefighter in Portland, Oregon for nearly 25 years, and his funeral was one of the largest firefighter services the city had ever seen, covered by the news, with traffic escorted for nearly 20 miles. Knowing how many people cared gave me some peace. It has been almost 4 years, and the grief still comes in waves. I have since married, had a baby boy, and even been hired by the city of Portland as a lead web developer working closely with the Fire Bureau, which is difficult because I often think about how we would have worked together. Still, I am grateful I had such an incredible father and the time I was given with him. Story 29. I watched my mom die from cancer over the course of about a week. More than 10 years earlier, she had been diagnosed with melanoma skin cancer. The affected area was removed, and she was screened every 6 months after that, with no further findings. My wife and I were married in July 2008, and the following month we moved from Pennsylvania to Florida. In November of that same year, my mom called to tell me they had found lung cancer. A week later, she called again to say it had spread to her spine and brain, though the brain lesions were small and doctors were hopeful about radiation and chemotherapy. That Christmas, my wife and I took time off to visit family in Pennsylvania. My mom seemed relatively okay, depressed but still herself. We went bowling for my dad's birthday, and as a family we shaved my mom's head because radiation had caused her hair to thin, which oddly brought her some comfort because she was not facing it alone. A month later, she had surgery to remove part of a tumor pressing on her spine, and another month after that she finished radiation on her head, and doctors began discussing chemotherapy and radiation for her back. In March 2009, just 3 months later, my dad called to say my mom had suffered a seizure caused by a coronary embolism and was in the hospital. That Sunday, my sister called and gently prepared me that things might not be looking good. I told my wife I needed to go home and booked a flight for Monday morning. That night, around 11 in the evening, my dad called me crying and said I needed to come home immediately, and I was able to tell him I was already coming. My arrival was kept a surprise from my mom, who was lucid but on pain medication. My grandfather picked me up from the airport and drove me to the hospital. As I turned the corner near her room, she happened to be looking down the hallway and saw me, thinking she was imagining things. I held her hand and talked with her, but when I stepped into the hallway alone, I completely broke down. Just 3 months earlier, she had been walking, laughing, and smiling, and now she was bald from radiation, hooked to machines, and had lost around 15 pounds. I went back in and talked with her the rest of the night, and she was tired but fully conversational. Overnight, her condition worsened, her pain increased, and she slipped into a lethargic state where she mostly slept. Doctors agreed to send her home on hospice care, but told us they did not expect her to survive the next 24 hours. She was taken home by ambulance, oxygen and medication were set up, and our house filled with family and friends. The front door was never locked. We sat around her bed telling stories, laughing, crying, and celebrating her life. 2 days later, well beyond what doctors expected, she was still holding on, though fluid could be heard in her lungs as she breathed. Around 6:30 in the morning, her breathing worsened and she began to shake. I held her hand, told her I loved her, and told her it was okay to go. She passed shortly after, surrounded by family. We stepped outside to watch the sunrise, knowing she was no longer in pain. At her viewing days later, the line stretched out the door of the funeral home. The director said he had never seen so many people attend a viewing. My mom had been a teacher's aide at a junior high school and had touched countless lives, including students who came with their parents. She was 47 years old. My wife and I were 23, my sister was 24, and my parents had been married for 27 years. Story 30. When I was 7 years old, my parents finally gave in and bought me a dog. We were in the process of moving to a new house and still had a few months before everything was finished. So my mom and I would drive out there several times a week to drop things off, check on the progress, and play in the woods with the puppy. My dad had stretched a chain across the driveway to block access until construction was done, and every time we arrived, it was my job to grab the key, jump out of the back seat, unlock the chain, and hop back into the car so we could drive up to the house. The puppy, who was about 6 months old, always sat in the back seat with me. One morning, the three of us went out there like usual. I unlocked the chain, got back into the car, and closed the door. As soon as my mom started driving, I was slammed hard against the door and felt intense pain. I looked down and realized the dog's leash must have fallen out when I got out of the car, and I had not noticed it when I climbed back in. As the car moved forward, the leash was dragged under the rear tire. The puppy was yanked violently from the back seat into my lap, and both of us were pinned against the closed door. I was screaming and crying uncontrollably while the dog made horrible choking sounds as the leash tightened around his neck, nearly tearing his head off. I screamed at my mom to stop the car and tried to explain what was happening while my leg was being crushed and my dog was dying in my arms. She put the car into reverse, but because the leash was still trapped in the closed door, the tension did not release. I do not remember if I could not reach the door handle or if I was simply too terrified to think clearly. My mom jumped out of the car and opened the door from the outside. The dog had been strangled to death, and I was not seriously injured. I still remember the overwhelming helplessness I felt, and even now thinking about it makes me feel sick. Story 31. I went to the same summer camp in the mountains every year from the age of 5 until about 15, and this happened when I was 10. The main house was full of mostly the same kids from previous years. That summer, one of the bungalows housed an elderly couple and their two granddaughters, Mary, who was around my age, and Katie, who was 2 years old. Mary was awkward and quiet, and most of the kids were not very nice to her. I knew what it felt like to be an outcast, so I tried to befriend her and her little sister. Katie was the cutest and most advanced 2-year-old I had ever seen, with rosy cheeks and chubby arms and legs. She was always wandering off on her own, constantly worrying the adults. One day it was gray and drizzly, so we stayed inside playing video games. Mary rushed in asking if anyone had seen Katie, but everyone was too focused on the Sega to pay attention, as usual. About an hour later, I noticed a lot of commotion outside. Katie had been missing for an hour. A search party formed. Some kids ran down to the stream, thinking she might have fallen in since she loved water. That made me think of the pool. When I got there, the small gate was still locked, but Katie was floating face down in the water. Her grandfather must have followed me because suddenly he was there, diving in to pull her out. Her cheeks were the same icy blue as the pool. The next moments are blurry. Her grandfather tried to give her CPR while her grandmother collapsed to the ground, screaming at God and pounding the dirt with her fists until they were raw. Kids were screaming and running everywhere while the adults tried to herd them away and block the view. It was Katie's birthday. She had turned 3 that day. Her grandparents had been celebrating when she climbed out a window, made it to the pool, climbed over the gate, hit her head on the railing, and fell in. One disturbed kid even said he hoped she died while we waited for the hospital to call back, and I punched him in the stomach. That night, Mary hugged me and cried, telling me it was all her fault because she had prayed for a baby sister. That was the day I stopped believing in God. Story 32. This one actually happened to me, and the horrifying part was what I saw afterward. I was in 4th grade during recess, playing a dumb game with other kids where we threw a ball back and forth over a baseball dugout. The roof slanted upward on our side, so we could not throw the ball back over. The kids on the other side got frustrated and started throwing whatever they could find. I bent down to grab a stick when suddenly something struck my head and everything went black. I later learned a large rock with a sharp edge had hit me directly on the top of my skull, splitting my scalp open. I came to seconds later with blood pouring down my face and shirt. I did not feel pain at first, probably from shock, but seeing the blood terrified me and I started crying. Every kid on the playground froze and stared at me in horror, and some of the girls covered their eyes. 2 teachers ran over and picked me up to carry me inside. I was panicking and asked if I was going to die, and one of them said she did not know, which was about the worst possible answer. Moments later, another teacher came out, saw me, screamed in horror, and grabbed her head. That reaction is what made me realize how bad it really was. I passed out again from blood loss and shock, and woke up in the emergency room, where I received a blood transfusion and multiple stitches. I recovered fully, but the look of terror on everyone's faces that day is something I will never forget. When I saw that teacher react the way she did, I truly believed that was the end. Story 33. I was driving home from a friend's house following behind another friend of mine, and for some reason we were talking on the phone. Suddenly he said, "Hang on, is that someone lying in the street?" He pulled over with his headlights on. I stopped behind him, and we both got out and rushed over to a man lying unconscious in the gutter. This was a quiet residential neighborhood, and the man looked to be in his early 40s, wearing jogging clothes. He was bleeding heavily from his head, with blood running down into his eyes. My friend called emergency services, and right then we saw the man take one deep, strained breath. Not long after, a cyclist trained in cardiopulmonary resuscitation and an off-duty emergency medical technician arrived and began trying to help him. It did not appear that he had been hit by a car, and it seemed more like a sudden medical event, possibly a heart issue or aneurysm. A woman then stepped forward and explained that she had seen him collapse on his own, but she had been walking with 4 very young children and had taken them home before she could do anything, which was right around when we arrived. When the paramedics finally showed up, the man had not taken a breath for about 10 minutes. They did not seem rushed, though they still placed a breathing device on him and loaded him onto a stretcher. We never learned what happened, but it felt very clear that the single breath we witnessed was his last. Story 34. I watched a very close friend slowly die from cancer. She had just come home from the hospital the day before due to complications from the disease, which by then had spread into her bones. At one point, she had unknowingly lived with a broken hip for 6 months because her pain level was already so severe. Despite everything, she seemed to be doing well that day. She and her husband even went out and bought a new television, knowing she would soon be confined to bed for a long time. That night, she suffered a stroke in her sleep. I went to visit her the next day because we were told the end was near. I sat beside her, gently stroking her hair while her body convulsed. She could not speak, and I do not know if she even knew we were there. We left briefly to get something to eat, planning to return right away, but she passed while we were gone. When we came back to say goodbye, I touched her hand, and it was still warm,